All right, everybody. So this is chapter 4, How is Speech Planned and Produced? Speech error is when we intend to say one word but say another instead. This is a speech error. It's also called a slip of the tongue. And these are a naturally occurring phenomenon that can happen to anybody. Speech fluency, on the other hand, is when speech is smooth and comes out as intended. Speech disfluencies are a pause or stutter in speech, but not a full-blown speech error. Now, these are relatively rare. According to your textbook, these only occur in about 6% of utterances. Speech pathologists and psycholinguists would refer to speech disfluency as two different phenomena, though. So interestingly, speech pathologists would classify speech disfluency as the differentiation between the selected word by a speaker and how it's perceived by a listener. Contrastingly, a psycholinguist would classify speech disfluency as abnormal sounding speech rather than focusing on what exactly is said. Essentially then, to a speech pathologist, the speech disfluency comes in the form of two different people, the speaker and the listener, having an incongruent interpretation of what was meant to be said by the speaker and what was heard by the listener. Psycholinguists, on the other hand, would argue that speech disfluency occurs when speech simply sounds abnormal. A lot of what we know about speech, both how it is produced and discovered, is a direct result of researching speech errors. So interestingly, most of what we know about speech errors is not based on perfect speech or good speech even, but rather speech errors that people make. These findings are generally done through systematic observation. And generally speaking, systematic observation is tedious work on account of the fact that the average person only makes about a speech error on 2% of utterances. So generally speaking, 2% is not a lot of data to go off of, especially if a researcher were to miss several utterances, which is completely possible in a naturalistic study. The most common type of speech error is a spoonerism. So a spoonerism occurs when a speaker transposes the first two letters of two or more words onto the other word. So for example, my roommates and I often commit a spoonerism on purpose when we say we're going to shake a tower. Around our house, we know that means take a shower, but we purposefully transpose the S and the T onto the opposite words. We just like to think we're funny like that. On the other hand, I commit a natural spoonerism where I say that I need to mow the lawn. I generally say I need to mow the lawn. It's something that I struggle with and say almost every time. So that's a natural spoonerism that I have, and just another example of transposing the M and the L onto mow and lawn. Freudian slips. I'm sure you've all heard of Freudian slips. It's important to note, though, that not all Freudian slips are sexual in nature. Oftentimes, Freudian slip is just a reflection of what is on the mind of the speaker that they might not want the listener to know about. Additionally, these are one of the most uncommon speech errors that are committed. So if pop culture media makes them seem really popular or really common, they're doing so for dramatic effect or comedic effect, but it's not realistic, which I know is surprising to all of you because movies and TV shows are very realistic at all times. Born in 1923, Dr. Victoria Vicky Frommkin became one of the most influential and important people in the field of psycholinguistics. She recorded the largest corpus of speech errors in the field. So this corpus that she recorded included not only the speech error, but also the information regarding the context that the error was made in, the context of what was meant to be said, and the likely intended utterance. And this is a lot of information, which was pretty groundbreaking at the time, and even now is pretty groundbreaking. Dr. Frommkin helped humankind's understanding of how speech is planned and produced in a myriad of different ways. One of the most noteworthy ways that she did this was by developing a model of speech planning and production, and we'll talk about that more later. So some common mistakes in speech. Similar or the same examples to these can be found in your textbook, so if you don't understand them or if you miss one of them while you're taking notes, you can always go back into your textbook and look at them. So a phoneme being left out is an omission. And an example of that is my dog likes to bar. It should have been my dog likes to bark, but the K was left out, so a phoneme was missing, and that is omission. Phonemes being put in the wrong place, which is called an addition. I have about 100 things to do Tuesday, not Tuesday the day, but Tozday. So I added a Z. Of course, accidentally, but that is an addition, is adding a Z to today. A pair of phonemes switching position is called an exchange. I'm not as think as you drunk I am. Should have been I'm not as drunk as you think I am. I will note that this is a lexical exchange, not a phonological exchange. So phonological exchanges only replace phonemes. Lexical exchanges switch whole words or utterances, like in the example. So basically, in this example, the lexical exchange was I switched think and drunk. So instead of I'm not as drunk as you think I am, I'm not as think as you drunk I am. Phonemes being placed later when they should be placed earlier is called an anticipation. An example of that is a week-long race or a week-long race. So I was anticipating the R at the beginning of race and misapplied it to week. And then finally, we have phonemes being placed earlier when they should be produced later. So these are called perseverations. And an example of that is also share, which should be also share. I added the SH from share to also. And basically, this is just the opposite of anticipation. So more speech errors include the morpheme stranding error. Simply put, a morpheme stranding error occurs when suffixes like ish and ing are in the right place but attached to the wrong word. So an example is I loving walk should be I love walking. I loving walk is a phrase. It's not necessarily correct grammar, but I put the ing at the end of the wrong word. So it's in the right place. It's the end of a word, but it's on the wrong word. Some speech errors are much more common depending on the language you're speaking. So, for example, a speech error can be more common in Dutch than it can be in English, or more common in Spanish than French, for instance. If you're interested in these, there's a lot of examples of these in your book. So go ahead and look there if you're really interested in this part of this section. Another speech error is called a malapropism. A malapropism occurs when a listener does not catch an error made by the speaker due to the similar nature of the two words. So remember those Discover credit card commercials where the two guys were on the phone and they were talking about fraud and frog protection? That's an example of a malapropism. When you have fraud or frog protection, and the two parties can't really tell the difference between the two words. And speech errors can also involve nonverbal language. Examples of these include slips of the hands and sign language, and language production errors called slips of the finger. And again, those are both involved in sign language. Speaker disfluencies oftentimes happen without the listener noticing. The most common type of disfluency happens on the part of the speaker when they seemingly randomly interrupt themselves to correct an error made that the listener may or may not have even noticed. And this generally happens really quickly and generally happens with no gap or space occurring in between. So for example, the listener has no time, or not no time, but has very little time between when the speaker commits the error and then corrects the error because they do it so quickly. So an example of this is I have a meeting at 11 a.m. tomorrow. No, sorry. I have a meeting at 11:30 a.m. tomorrow. I'm sure you've all had this happen to you or have recognized someone else do it. It happens pretty frequently. And these repairs oftentimes disrupt the fluency of smoothness of speech and conversation, and they don't necessarily need to because the listener doesn't really notice that it actually happens. Some other types of disfluencies are filled pauses without repair. So when a speaker uses or that's a filled pause without repair. I'm sure you'll notice it. I know I'm going to notice it every time that I say it now during the rest of this lecture, which is going to annoy everyone, I think. Silences are similar to filled pauses, but they're not filled. So it's just silence. Hesitation caused by inability or trouble producing a word. An example of this would be tip of the tongue syndrome. So when you're speaking and you just can't find that word that you want to say, that's a hesitation caused by an inability to produce a word. And then lastly is stuttering. This can be a long-term, lifelong problem or a very infrequent problem for a person. It really just kind of depends on who you are and how much, like how severe it is, but also how much you work on practicing to not do it. And an interesting thing is that President-elect Biden has struggled with a stutter all his life, and he still does to some extent. And you can notice that when he speaks to large crowds, a lot of people think that he has a hesitation caused by an inability or trouble producing a word, but it's actually his stutter that gets in the way, which is just an interesting thing to me. So section 2 of this chapter is about laboratory studies of speech production. Speech studies have been conducted since the mid-20th century. These studies have mostly centered around speech errors, but there have been some studies that focus more on speech production, similar to the naturalistic studies of speech that I mentioned earlier. There are several ways in which a researcher can study speech, but the most popular way to conduct research is via laboratory studies. So research participants are invited into a lab and their speech is recorded. While participants are speaking, researchers diligently pay attention to and record data specific to what they're looking for. And this sounds like a relatively simple process, but it is more in-depth than just recording data. One example of this is Goldman Eisler's research from the 1950s. Goldman Eisler's research found that people talk fast or slow across most situations and in most circumstances. Therefore, it is unlikely that a person is talking quickly because they're nervous. Rather, that person probably just always talks at a quicker pace. Additionally, this research found the way in which you perceive another person speaking is based on the way you take pauses in your speech. So, for example, I've been told by many people that I speak very quickly. The listeners who tell me this information are basing it off their own speech and how they formulate their speech. So, for example, the people who have told me that I talk quickly will probably talk more slowly with more frequent and longer pauses as compared to how they're perceiving me formulate my speech, which is formulated at a quicker pace and with fewer and or quicker pauses than they would use. More recent research has found the speed of speech, for the most part, goes up as age does. So young children talk slower than adolescent children do. Adolescent children speak slower than adults. However, that being said, once you hit a certain age, about the middle of your life, your speech begins to slow again, and this is due to stiffened muscles used in speech production. So as you age, your speech will sort of get quicker and quicker until it plateaus for a while, and then around the middle of your life, it will start to decline in speed again. One thing to note is that the studies above are observational. They're not true experiments. For a study to be a true experiment, one or more variables needs to be manipulated by the experimenter in order to influence the outcome. And it's just important that you know the difference between observational and true experiments. Most research studies are actually designed to make participants make more frequent mistakes than they normally would. Off the bat, this statement seems pretty unethical because it would mean that researchers are not presenting accurate data on realistic or actual human speech production. That being said, it is understandable. In order to catch a person in a natural speech error, hundreds of hours of data would need to be collected on hundreds of different people. That research in itself would be time-consuming, invasive, and probably unethical because it's so invasive, costly. It would be there's a whole bunch of barriers to it. So for those reasons, Inducing speech errors is more effective than waiting for them to occur naturally in people's speech. One, I can't think of the word. Wow. One speech study that produces speech errors is the Spoonerisms of laboratory-induced predisposition, or the SLIP technique. The SLIP technique of conducting research involves showing participants word pairings that create a possible Spooner effect, as discussed earlier. Around 30% of the time, participants will make a mistake on the last pairing, since it's less natural to say darn bore than it is to say barn door. And then there's an example given here. This research was instrumental in proving that people will generally make a mistake more often if the word they mistake is a real word. And this is called the lexical bias effect. So remember my example from earlier about how I always need to low the mon, or modal on. In this technique, people would actually be less likely to mistakenly say this statement because mon is not an actual word. And that is the lexical bias effect. Bars and co-researchers found that speakers could edit their speech relatively late during their speech planning. A quick note on this, however, is that non-word speech errors were more easily caught than errors involving actual words. So, for example, a word that is not a real word, like my very overused example of mon, is more easily caught than if I were to say shake a tower, since shake and tower are both words, but mon is not a real word. Fun fact, it's highly unlikely that you will make a mistake using an inappropriate or taboo word. So a common misconception, not only about Freudian slips, but also about word production in general, is that it's highly unlikely that you or anyone else will commit a speech error using an inappropriate or taboo word. That means when your girlfriend or boyfriend or partner is introducing you to their parents, you can feel relatively safe in knowing that you probably won't say something sexual or expletive unless you mean to. And one final word on this fun fact. Wegner and co-researchers found that the more we try and not think about something, the more we actually do think about that thing, and the more apt we are to say the thing we're not trying to say or think about. So, further research shows that the more conscious of or afraid of making a mistake we are, the more prone we are to make that mistake. So, for example, I remember all the way back in middle school, I sat at a table with 3 other people in my biology class, and there was this one girl at the table who never wanted to read aloud to the class. She was always afraid she was just going to make a mistake and that people were going to make fun of her. So one day, our teacher made her read aloud to the class, and the entire section that she read, she kept pronouncing the word organism as orgasm, which obviously made everybody laugh because we thought it was hilarious. Once the class quieted down, though, she asked us what she did wrong, and we told her, and her face just turned a bright red. So with that example in mind, it's likely that if she had not focused so much on not making a mistake, she probably wouldn't have made the mistake that she did make. So, when you're trying not to think about something, the chances are you're going to think about it more and then actually possibly do it. So keep that in mind next time that you're trying to not do something. Sentence production begins with the phonological process. Several studies utilize the tongue twister paradigm and for several different objective outcomes. So in some research, already mentioned, researchers ask participants to recite difficult sentences, and I'm going to try to do one right now, and I might mess it up completely, but Sally sells Sally sells seashells by the seashore. But they make these sentences harder by adding an extra word, making the idea more complex, or making it longer. And this creates something called a tongue twister paradigm. The textbook talks a lot about this and more specific outcomes in relation to different tongue twister paradigms and their research. So if you want to look at more specific outcomes of the tongue twister paradigm, be sure to refer to your textbook because they have actually a lot of different experiments run using it and the outcomes of all those research studies. We may make errors out loud, but we also make errors that are only in our heads. So using our inner voices, the lifelong monologue that you have going on in your head, is another place you can make speech errors just without actually verbalizing them. Reading personal and or longer pieces of text activate our inner voices. When we read something personal, like there's a speech error. A letter written by a parent, close friend, or mentor. When we read that to ourselves in our own heads, not reading it out loud, we generally read those letters either in the voices of the person who wrote it or in our own heads. If we read something long by somebody we don't know, it's most likely the case that we read it in our own voices. So if my mom wrote me a letter, I would most likely read it in either my voice or her voice. If I read a poem by Robert Frost, since I don't know what his voice sounds like, I would most likely read it in, well, actually not most likely, I would read it in my own inner voice. And a person's inner speech reflects their regional dialect. So this is interesting because we all have accents. It may not seem like we have accents to the people who we've lived with for a long time or lived in the area for a long time. But if we go somewhere else, we do have an accent, right? So I've lived in Washington my whole life, but if I were to go to Texas or Boston or even the UK, I would be the one with the accent, not them. Even though they would sound differently to me, I would be the outlier there. This makes me curious. If we move, like if I were to move to Texas, I wonder if my auditory voice would not change, but if my inner voice would, or vice versa, or both. So if my verbal voice or inner voice, I wonder which one would change first, or if which one would change more dramatically, that kind of thing. So there may be some good research in there. I don't know how you would quantify it, but it would be an interesting sort of experiment to run. It's likely that motor formulation or execution of speech are the reason that speakers make speech errors. It's interesting to think about that our speech errors are potentially made before we start speaking. This may go back to not wanting to make an error or to impress somebody or have flawless speech, or whatever reason we're trying to not make a speech error. But generally, it's not the motor formulation or execution that causes us to make that error. Dell and Repka continued this path of research, and they found that inner speech practice will only reduce inner speech errors. So for example, earlier I talked about a stutter. So a person who struggles with a stutter practices speech in their head using their inner voice. This person gets really good at speaking with their inner voice and not having a stutter. When it comes to actually speaking out loud to another person, though, it's unlikely that this progress will translate to their verbal speech. So I guess in a way, the progress you make in your head only really applies to your inner voice, not to your verbal voice. Over the past few years, it has been found in a number of research experiments that we form utterances syllable by syllable rather than phoneme by phoneme. So this then means that during speech production, individual syllables are stored and retrieved from memory and help us formulate full sentences and thoughts rather than simply individual sounds or letters. So think of a person beginning to learn sign language versus somebody who is fluent in sign language. When the beginner is starting out, they will likely spell words out using individual letters because it's all they know how to do. This is representative of producing speech phoneme by phoneme. Contrastingly, a person who's fluent in sign language will produce various gestures that are whole words or phrases, and this is representative of a person speaking and forming speech syllable by syllable. In an experiment by Schiefers and co-researchers, participants were listening to a distractor while trying to complete a picture naming task. The pictures were either semantically related, phonologically related, or unrelated to the distractor. This experiment is elaborated on in your textbook, but essentially what it boils down to is that semantic processing during word production comes before phonological processing. In other words, the meaning of words comes before the actual formation and components of the words, utterances, or sentences. So basically, you know what you want to say, or the idea of what you want to say, before you have the words to actually say it, which is interesting, to me at least. Morphological and syntactic processes. So a popular debate within the field of psycholinguistics is whether people form utterances clause by clause, so e.g. pieces of a sentence, or word by word. This is an interesting thing to think about. Think about the last time you spoke in class, which I know might have been a long time ago. But have you found yourself looking for a word in the middle of your sentence, or looking for where the sentence was actually going, or both? So if you're looking for like where your sentence is going, much like I'm doing right now, it might be that you're looking for a clause of the sentence. Or if you have tip of the tongue syndrome, wherein you can't think of a word, then you might be producing sentences word by word, which is interesting to think about because I think that happens to all of us. Both of those things happen to all of us. English speakers are very likely to produce sentences containing verb agreement error. A verb agreement error happens when a subject is brought into a sentence and the following verb does not match that subject. This occurs most often when there's a modifying clause, increasing the wordiness of the sentence and therefore increasing the likelihood that a mistake will be made. There are several studies discussed regarding this and all the rest of the topics mentioned in this lecture within your textbook, so make sure and read. Section 3 of this chapter is the models of speech production. So a rather booming area of research within psycholinguistics is that of the time it takes from an idea to articulation, or in other words, the process of thinking to speaking. Models of speech production are supposed to give us an idea of this, but it's likely impossible for us to conceptualize in our own heads the actual process because it happens so quickly. Early models, like the serial processing model, initially thought that one step at a time with no overlapping processes was the way in which we formed speech. In this case, we formed a thought, processed it, and then spoke it. Later theories, like the parallel processing model, instead theorized that we can actually form thoughts, process them, and speak them simultaneously and in no particular order. Early models were like around the 70s, and later models have been like the 90s and up to now, just for reference. Serial processing models. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Vicky Fromkin, one of her biggest contributions to this field was the serial processing model. This model proposed that each utterance goes through a 5-stage plan and is executed one at a time in a perfect sequence. The stages are as follows: selecting an utterance's meaning, selecting utterance syntax, selecting utterance stress pattern and tone, selecting utterance content and function words, and selecting utterance phonemes. So as you might imagine, this process seems very long and drawn out, but it actually happens so quickly that once we become efficient at speaking, it happens super quickly and without us ever even noticing. All the information on the previous slide regarding Dr. Fromkin's model was based on her huge corpus of errors that she collected. One of the advantages of Dr. Fromkin's serial processing model was that it was incredibly easy to pinpoint exactly where a mistake was made when a speech error was committed by a speaker. Merrill Garrett also has a serial processing model. Garrett collected his own corpus, found that most exchange errors occurred within the same clause. The major difference between Garrett's and Fromkin's models are that you can not only determine where the speech error occurred, but also why it occurred. And his model is shown in your textbook. I couldn't find a picture of it, or else I would have included it here. The third and final serial processing model is Bach and Lovelts, which is pictured above. Taking inspiration from Garrett's model of processing, these two models actually ended up being extremely similar, with almost even the same. One place where these models are different, however, is in the fact that Bach and Lovelts explain in much more depth the processing that goes on in language formation, specifically in the functional stage and the positional stage. And these models seem complex and convoluted, so if they're a little bit intimidating or hard to understand at first, that's totally okay, because they are complex. So don't worry if you don't exactly get it yet. Moving on to parallel processing models. So in contrast to serial processing models, parallel processing models, first proposed by Dell in 1986, assert that each level of processing has the ability to influence any other level at any time. So opposite the serial processing models, parallel processing models utilize bidirectional processing wherein there are no set stages of order. The connections go from one to the other in any order. So think of riding an escalator versus actually walking and climbing the stairs. So when you're riding an escalator, you can only go one direction, up or down, and it's frowned upon if you move at a different pace than the escalator is moving, right? That's like serial processing models, is you can only go in one direction at one speed, and you can only achieve certain outcomes after you've achieved the one before it. Parallel processing models are more like taking the stairs. So you can go up or down if you want to. You can go at your own pace. You can skip steps. You can walk on the left or on the right side. There's a lot more freedom in it. And so parallel processing models are like taking the stairs. There's more freedom in it. You can go at your own pace. You can go either direction. So that's maybe not the best analogy, but it's the analogy that I came up with. So I hope that helps a little bit in that. One thing that the parallel processing model does account for, however, is the rarest speech error. So this model can account for the most rare type of speech error, which is the mixed error, which is a speech error related to both sound and meaning of the intended word. And then the last section is section 4. It's pretty short, but handwriting and other forms of language. So the difference between verbal speech and nonverbal speech seems simple because it is. So essentially the biggest difference between written language and vocal language articulation lies in using the auditory muscles such as the larynx and throat, wherein word processing involves movement of the hands, handwriting, texting, speaking with the hands via American Sign Language, etc. There are 3 stages involved in handwriting language production. The first is planning, the second is translating into sentences, and the third is editing. And finally, there's no consensus as to how words are formed when writing. But the agreed upon idea is that at the very minimum, words are planned in groupings, not individual letters. And yeah, that's it for chapter 4. I'll talk to you guys soon.